welcome to the Malta Insight Series. Today we're going to be discussing a case study of a British high-profile golfer with a panel of experts. We're producing the Malta Insight Series in partnership with Seed. Delighted today to be joined by Nikki Gouda, who's partner of Seed in Malta, also by Chris Hogarth, who is Wealth Planning Director at Cosmo Capital in London, and finally Mo Pasricha, who's the Head of Sport at McCrell Solicitors in London. So welcome, gentlemen.
Morning.
Hi, David.
Morning.
Nikki, just coming to you first, I mean, before we get into the specifics of this case, how do you work with sports stars from your business at Seed down in Malta?
Yes, we do quite a bit of work in the sports industry, particularly I would say with what I call mobile athletes. So similar to a golfer who's regularly traveling and who's not fixed to one jurisdiction for most time of the year. The planning that we do varies from client to client. So as you know, Malta's system is a remittance-based system. So we do planning which is based solely on having his presence and his tax residence in Malta, to a more fully fledged planning in terms of image rights management companies and also managing the wealth of those individuals through our licensed trust company. So it varies from one client to another, but I would say, speaking broadly, this is the various services we offer to individuals in this industry.
Perfect, thanks. And Chris Hogarth, I mean, how do you work with clients in the sports sector?
Yeah, morning, David. So Cosmo Capital is a global wealth management firm. We're 40% owned by the Schroders family still, which is great because it gives it a real sort of family client-focused feel while still being a FTSE 100 company. Where I work is I specialise on providing wealth planning advice to those in the sports and entertainment industry. So that's where we were looking really to protect a client's wealth, look at how we can efficiently grow that wealth, and then quite crucially looking at how we plan that wealth, forming around that quite a specialised and specific career over a period of time. Within Cazenove, and what we do very well is you'll always get a wealth planner, so it's myself, and you'll get an investment specialist. So you have two specialists looking at the underpinning of the investments, and myself with the wealth planning on how you plan around that. And then very much as we are today, working with other professionals as part of a team to provide that kind of comprehensive service. That's how we work with individuals.
Okay, many thanks. And Mo, what about yourself from the legal side? How do you work with sports clients?
Thank you, David, and morning to you and Chris and Nikki. Yes, so from my point of view, we help and assist clients with pretty much every legal aspect of their lives, whether that's pre-career, during career, post-career. We're quite fortunate to have full service offering as a law firm, and also to be able to service those clients through our Mackerel International Network, which has around 4,500 lawyers around the world. So we do a lot of international work for the professional athletes we work with. In the London practice, we specifically are very pro-athlete. Our client book is predominantly looking after the individual athlete and their commercial contracts, their branding issues, their family issues, when they're purchasing properties, etc. So we tend to kind of almost give them that one-stop shop experience from the legal point of view. And then again, we very closely work with the likes of Chris and Nikki when their expertise is needed, because we're quite big believers in ensuring the athletes receive a collective expertise. So we do a lot of collaborative work with other advisors, together with servicing clients through the legal services we offer.
Okay, perfect. Right, well, we're going to introduce this case study now. It's a case of Jack Edwards, who's a professional golfer. He's 35 years old, UK passport holder, married with 2 children. He spends several months a year in different countries at tournaments and in training. He competes in the key tournaments in Europe and the Middle East. He is a high-profile player with promotional contracts with leading brands in golf, luxury and leisure sectors. In the longer term, but that's 10 years plus away, he's likely to sign lucrative contracts with media companies for commentary and reporting on key tournaments. Following COVID, the family are considering moving out of the UK and are considering a number of jurisdictions to fit their lifestyle down the line. So just coming to some of the key issues here. I mean, firstly, looking at some of the wealth management considerations, to bring you in, Chris, I mean, how do professional sports stars manage the challenge of potentially short periods of high earnings with a long retirement? I mean, golfers have the potential to have a very long career, but injuries and unforeseen circumstances can cut earnings drastically short. So how do you see this challenge for in golf, but also in other sectors?
Yeah, no, very good question, David, and it's one we come up against quite frequently with this kind of sector. I think where we start from is we very much get to know the player and understand what's important to them, what are they looking to achieve, what do they want their career to kind of build for them and their family over a long period of time. I mentioned before that we look to plan our clients' wealth, and the way we go about that is we put into place a cash flow forecasting or modelling system where we can model a client's future from a financial perspective to see what that looks like and then what are the potential risks along that career. So very much so, it's a very important process to start with that point for individuals who are quite frequently in this area, very young, earning a lot of money very quickly. Depending on the sport, it could be for a short period of time and with an early retirement age. And also with the fact that usually sports individuals are young and maybe not necessarily experienced within finance or legal or kind of accountancy factors, I think I very much see it as part of a guidance role as much as anything else. And not just on my own, but as Mo said before, as a team of us working together so that we're all working and swimming in the same direction to point that to a professional player in the right direction for the long term. So I think the cash flow modelling is very much the starting point for that. And I think without that cash flow modelling, coming to, I guess, a golf analogy, you're kind of swinging in the dark. You're kind of just hitting it and hoping for the best. Whereas with the cash flow modelling, with the professional advisors around you, you kind of think of us as a financial caddy to make sure that you're pointing your investments or you're planning in the right direction.
Thanks. So and that cash flow modelling can take various scenarios. So to sort of say, if your current income levels and your expenditure levels are set at certain numbers, well, what if that income fell by half because some contract fell away, or there's a 5-year deal that's been signed, but what if that doesn't get renewed? And is that the way you'd approach it? Look at the fixed costs they might have in their life, school fees and mortgages and things like that, and then model the income as well, and then get to walk through a variety of outcomes.
Exactly that, yeah. And also it's building in those risks. So again, by being a professional sports player, there's always that risk of injury. There's always that risk that performance can tail off and you're not necessarily in favour. So it's something which comes very quickly, but has the risk of going very quickly. So we want to make sure that we're protecting our clients, that we're maximising that wealth whilst they're earning it. But when the day comes that it's not necessarily there, that they're equally protected and have sufficient wealth behind them to account for that. Okay. So yeah, the modelling really helps from that point of view.
And I guess a big part of that is the tax efficiency side. If you've got a short career window where you're earning, perhaps into the millions, and you're paying a lot of tax, how do you work with sports stars who are looking to look at different tax efficient vehicles that they can invest through to make sure that they pay the right amount of tax, but they also have sufficient resources for their retirement and longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a good question. So tax efficiency is equally, if not more important than actually investment returns. And people often forget about that. They always think, well, where am I going to invest to get that growth? Actually, tax erosion can have a huge impact on your long-term savings. So it's really important for us to be maximising tax efficiency. For players and sports individuals specifically, that can be quite niche. So if you're earning large amounts throughout the year, that can affect things that you can contribute towards, say, pensions. Pension is an extremely efficient and tax efficient vehicle, but within the UK, if you're earning over a certain amount of money, then the amount you can pay into a pension is restricted quite significantly once you earn over 300,000, for example. So it's thinking, well, where's the other alternatives? Things like ISAs, small beer, probably in the general scheme of things, but it's always good to kind of get those basic release and allowances in play. And then we're looking at what are the structures you're using to actually invest within. So if you park your investment decisions as a second stage, the first stage is how are you approaching your investments? What structuring are you going through? And by structures, we mean things like ISAs or pensions, because they dictate the tax that is then being paid whilst the investments are growing. And also, coming back to the planning point, is it affects how you can actually withdraw that income when you need it, say, for example, in retirement. If we kind of make it relevant to the example we're talking about here, offshore bonds might be something that they would consider. Depends on the client's situation, but they bring different financial advantages in terms of being able to defer tax when you're drawing an income. So you could defer the tax on income that you're taking when you retire. It also benefits from the gross roll-up. And if you're offshore for a period of time, you get an allowance or a relief for those period of years you're away. Other things that we also see questions coming around are specialist investments like EIS and VCTs, which are enterprise investments and venture capital trusts. They're quite high risk on the spectrum, but they come with various tax reliefs. So again, as part of our holistic plan, we'll put together a proposal of these various structures and tax reliefs that can be taken advantage of.
Okay, and once the sort of wrappers or buckets of pools of assets are defined, how do you go about discussing the risk approach with a client such as this? You know, he's in his mid-30s, got a long potential career ahead. There's a long time horizon for investment before that money will necessarily need to be drawn down. You know, how do you start to approach this with a client?
Yeah, so the second stage of that conversation is the risk conversation. We're looking at the different types of investments that are out there. Cosmo can pretty much account for anything that a client wishes to do, and depending on how high or risk or cautious the client wants to be. There is no right or wrong answer. It really is a personal decision. So that comes into my initial point of getting to know the player and what they're looking to achieve, to see where they're comfortable. We want everyone to be able to sleep comfortably at night, not be worrying about what their investments are doing. So it's very much an important conversation to see where they sit on that risk profile. Depending on what the client's looking to achieve, will allow you to take different risk categories. And actually, you mentioned there, David, different pots. And that's a really good way of looking at it, is having different pots for different objectives, because other objectives will be short term, whereas you'll have some objectives which might be longer term. And you could afford to take potentially more risk with those longer term investments, whereas the shorter term objectives will probably be slightly less risk, or you might want to keep an element in cash for you to fall back onto or to cover a cost in a short period of time. So that conversation builds into it, and linking that back into the cash flow, we can build in different levels of risk and actually show what the impacts would be on that modeling before you actually make that decision, so we can visually illustrate what different decisions and risk levels would look like.
Great, and I guess as well, if there's some financial education to do, it's how you contrast, for example, an investment portfolio with a property portfolio, and some of the risks, and you know, those who are less financially literate might be driven towards thinking, oh, it's great if I'm fully invested in buy-to-let properties, then that will be my pension. Whereas actually, it needs to be looked at in a broader approach. Do you find that can be a common view or misconception?
Absolutely. I think that the Robbie Fowler effect is a powerful one. He's obviously done very well in property. It's well documented over the years. And that's not to say that property doesn't offer great opportunities for investments, but it's not the only asset class that you can go to. And I think property does come with its downsides in terms of it's quite illiquid. If you've got tenants in there, that can be quite sort of time consuming, and risks can come from that. Whereas investments give you a slightly different approach. And actually, you can access property investments via funds. You don't have to directly purchase a property yourself. That's not to say don't go into property. It can be quite interesting. You can touch and feel it. It's quite nice from that point of view. But I would say it should form part of an overall diversified portfolio. So have a bit in property, but also think about what you can do for an investment portfolio, from an equities or a bonds sort of well diversified sort of structured portfolio, which is where we can come in and add that value and manage that type of wealth for you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. And Mo, just to bring you in, I mean, we've discussed there some of the wealth management considerations and risks. What are some of the legal considerations for a player such as this in optimizing potential earnings over their career?
Well, it does very much link to Chris and what his objectives are. I mean, he does a very good job in understanding. I think one of the key things he mentioned was understanding that, you know, Jack's objective here and what he wants to achieve from his career, and then kind of working backwards and understanding those kind of key risks that come up traditionally in his golfing career, and where we expect there to be life events. So we do think about that when we're thinking about the legal considerations, because we cannot be purely reactive from a legal point of view. We have to start to think proactively, and we have to do that predominantly for not just Jack, but other players and lots of other athletes. And that's because there are risks, as you will appreciate, with someone of Jack's potential, his brand, and other players similar to him. And this is generally for most well-known athletes, or those athletes with a potential, you know, high earning career earnings over the next couple of years or 10 years, where we're looking at Jack in his view at the moment, there are contractual risks, there are risks in around relationships and his family, there are risks in relation to his brand and how he utilizes it. There'll be risks in relation to what Chris just touched upon, the touchy-feely element of the property investments they like to do, and making sure. And I think ultimately the legal considerations fundamentally come down to: are we structuring it correctly for the athlete and their long-term objectives that Chris has outlined? And secondly, are we putting in place the right kind of contractual protection, if possible? And if we take a couple of those examples by turn, we've talked about Jack, and you've talked about the fact that when you set out the beginning of this at the beginning of this talk about the fact he's got a wife and 2 kids and his family. Now, we need to think about how he is protected individually. Relationships and athletes traditionally have lots of negative connotations. You have some startling statistics across different sports, not necessarily applicable to Jack in his golfing career. I'm sure that has a much better statistic than footballers getting divorced at a rate of 40% after 2 years of finishing their Premier League career, which is staggeringly high. But that also lends itself to identify there is a risk there in the relationships that are built, what has been put in place. So whilst we might not be able to assist Jack right now, he is married, he might be able to do it. If there is relationship issues, he can still sign a mid-nuptial agreement, which is a very surprising thing for most people to hear about. But again, it regulates the affairs of both partners. If in the event something was to happen, contractually, as Chris has mentioned about, and you've mentioned, David, about the branding element and the endorsement deals that might be on the table, each of those deals need to be structured correctly and properly, and we need to think about the level of liability on Jack. And I'm sure we'll come on in this discussion to talk about how he holds those rights and how he utilizes them. But in the UK, most athletes look to utilize them, via a company, and that in effect adds some protection from a liability point of view. But it's not just simply the case of setting it up and it's done and leaving it, as Chris and Nikki will probably attest to. It's managing it day to day, making sure that the contracts have the right contract names on them, making sure that the contracts have been looked at, or there is a standard form. So there is a day-to-day element. So that's a big legal consideration. And then we've got the consideration, as I mentioned earlier, about the branding. So as an athlete, Jack will want to promote himself. You mentioned the fact he has he's a high-profile player. He's got these big promotional contracts. He's got multi-jurisdictional reach in terms of his name. And we need to be thinking about the right kind of structure. How is he holding those rights? How they're utilized? How they're licensed? Now, there are a multitude of legal considerations when it comes to structuring, what essentially is an image rights entity. I'm sure that's something we can talk further about, but that sets a little bit of the scene about the various different legal considerations involved in Jack's life at the moment.
It sounds fascinating. I imagine you're involved across like personal through business. There's it's a very blurred line between how
Absolutely.
you and look after their affairs.
Absolutely, and as as probably Chris and Nikki can attest to, when we're part of this team that you have here talking together, and we very much come out of that purely service provider role and come into that very trusted advisory role. You're part of that inner circle. And you all, I'm sure all of us will probably say about the various different odd requests we get from clients in this space, more than you possibly would from maybe a corporate client. That's not necessarily as generalization, but I think it is a typical thing. And that's because trust is a huge part of the relationship when it comes to the clients in this sector. It's a massive part of making things work.
Okay, many thanks. Just to pick off a couple of those topics. I mean, on the image rights structuring,
sure.
What are some of the key challenges, considerations, particularly for a UK resident in implementing a new structure such as that?
Yeah, I think this is always a question that pops up with athletes, and it's predominantly because they hear about it in the news, or another athlete has got something in place, or another athlete has spoken to their accountant and they've put an image rights deal in place. I think it's probably worth setting the scene for people listening to us speak today about image rights, and understanding that in the UK there's no definition of image rights as a collection of intellectual property rights. So the concept of image rights is still evolving in the United Kingdom, and we've seen big cases acknowledging they do exist and how they can work in different sports. But that expression of image rights usually covers, would cover Jack's name, Jack's likeness, images, photographs, Jack's signature on his autographs, his voice and his reputation. So taking that as a collective, you as an individual and Jack as an individual right now owns those, and every single person owns those, their name and likeness associated with themselves. And with Jack, he has the potential to potentially look at transferring or licensing that collection of intellectual property rights associated with his name and his likeness into a company. And there's the rationale for that lends a little bit upon what I said before about the kind of protection of liability. So Jack will want to kind of monetize, and he'll want to exploit his image. And by doing that, he can move his image into a company. He can once that company owns those rights or has the exclusive license of Jack's image rights, that image rights company, so we can call it, Jack's image right company for ease, will go out and enter into all of these big contracts with the Under Armours, the Nikes, the Pumas, the Reeboks of this world. In return, as a result, those contracts will be entered into with Jack's limited company and Puma Europe or Reebok Europe or whoever it may be. The company will receive the money from that deal, and ultimately Jack can be paid through dividends and capital payments, which is a far more tax efficient way of structuring his affairs. He'll have to take tax advice on the whole structure, so we usually work very closely with tax advisors and obtaining their opinion on making sure the structure is fit for purpose. So Jack could look to put that in place, but it's important for Jack to probably consider that whilst he can look to put it in place, there are a number of challenges and considerations with putting an image right structure there and getting the right expertise. There are lots of examples in the news, and I'm sure everyone can probably Google it, where you've seen HMRC have taken a very strong interest in how these structures have been put together, and especially when they are being seen to be more tax avoidance vehicles than being tax efficient vehicles. Now, HMRC over the years, especially there's a big case with Hull City that kind of set out the position on image rights as we currently understand it. And ultimately, I think that the kind of, from our point of view, there has to be an attributable value to Jack's image. So he's high profile, so he's likely to tick that initial box. If Jack was just an up and coming golfer, it might be difficult to do that. However, the balancing side to that is, if we transfer Jack's image when he was 16, 17, 18 into a company, the value of that transfer is so much lower. So this is why it's so important to begin the conversation quite early as a professional athlete and think, when is the right time for me to do this? Have I got the right advisors around me? And how do I structure it properly? And from my point of view, it's important that athletes such as Jack are aware that they do become a potential for attack from the tax authorities, because of how these structures have traditionally been looked at in the UK specific. I'm sure Nikki will tell us how wonderful other jurisdictions are around the world compared to the UK. So the key things are for Jack to think about is making sure there's good evidence to show the image rights contracts have been separately negotiated from his earnings, making sure there's kind of that real rationale for the values that have been involved. More often than not, values are just plucked out of the air, and that's where they become problems. And once they are in place, as I've mentioned before, it's not just getting the documentation and putting it in the filing cabinet. Once you've got it in place, make sure they're properly exploited. Most of the image rights cases that end up being disputed are because they're just thrown into a company and haven't actually been properly exploited. And also, it's important for the athlete, and we do this as a big part of our job as legal advisors, education for the athlete, making sure they understand what they are doing. breaking it simply down. This is what's happening. These are the pros and cons of having a structure in place. So we think hopefully that gives you an overview about that kind of potential for an image rights structure and the challenges that could be there.
Extremely helpful. We'll bring in Nikki in a sec on the Maltese image rights side, but I mean, Mo, just on the structure of commercial contracts while
Sure.
playing, post-playing career. I mean, how do you kind of differentiate between the different phases in the player's life and how they approach the exploitation of the assets that they built over there?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question, because lots of players just focus on what can I do, what's the structure of my contracts while I'm playing, not also considering about post-playing career earnings, and that's where we've got Chris, who will be able to showcase that life does exist after a professional playing career. You've still got to live 40, 50 years and pay for things. So the typical structure of these contracts vary ultimately. The contracts whilst they're playing, as I said, if they have a proper image rights structure set up in place, that entity will outlast the player's playing career. So actually that entity could be used whilst and enter into those commercial contracts whilst Jack is at the top of his game, winning the Masters and doing all the great stuff. And then 10, 15 years down the line, when he's jumping onto a podcast with the four of us and talking about how great his career is, and if he's going to receive a payment for that or an endorsement of it, that entity, that commercial entity can still enter into that contract and will still be there, and those contracts can be structured. Now, when they don't necessarily have those structures in place behind them, then there is obviously a consideration as to the individual's personal affairs at the time. So Chris would be able to guide that particular athlete and say, well, actually, you don't have this commercial structure behind you. How are we treating the fees that are coming in from your commercial contracts post-career compared to playing career? Hopefully that kind of explains that.
Very helpful. And on the litigation dispute side, I mean, just briefly, what are some of the risks that a player like this might face, and how can these structures help protect them against?
Yeah. Well, I think risk is, as lawyers, that's built into what we're about, really, highlighting the risks and hopefully coming up with some solutions. So the idea from Jack's point of view, he's got to be completely mindful of each of the contracts he enters into, the liability that's on him. So if he messes up for whatever reason, he could be sued by that brand. He could be pursued by another entity, and that has not only an impact on him, but could have a ripple effect on his other contracts. There are many examples of professional athletes that have unfortunately carried out a certain kind of action, and that's resulted in them losing their endorsement deals, or even being exposed to reduction mechanisms within deals. So what you will see with some of the biggest sporting brands in the world is that they will have reductions all pre-agreed for certain events. So for example, if Jack didn't turn up for an appearance, or he purposely decided to breach a clause of the contract in which he's endorsing a brand, there is an automatic preset reduction of the fee he's entitled to get. So we have to make sure we have structured and reviewed those clauses carefully to make sure they're fair, balanced and reasonable, and that it just can't be automatically triggered. From a liability point of view, as I said earlier, if he is entering into these contracts with the company, he has some protection, because obviously if the company is then entering into the contract, they're the legal person who that brand would have to look to if they were going to take any action. He could get protection standing behind that company, as opposed to himself personally being at risk and his personal assets being at risk, which is why it's so important to get these structures in place. From a dispute point of view, we see lots of athletes being targeted. So I think every 3 or 4 months, we pretty much sit down with most of our athletes quarterly to review their agreements, where they're at, any kind of risks associated, what they're up to. And I think it's important. It'll be important for Jack to have the benefit of that kind of advice on an ongoing basis.
Okay, perfect. Well, Nikki, to bring you in, I mean, we've heard there from Mo and Chris on the wealth management and on the legal side. Very interesting to hear your thoughts in response to them, first of all, but also, to give us a sense of particularly on the image rights side, how Malta would fit into this example.
I think, David, Mo touched upon a number of interesting facts and topics which we handle and we see from a Maltese side of things. A couple of things, for example, he mentioned, and I agree totally with the fact that it's important to begin early with these type of athletes. Also because that at a later stage in their career, typically their wealth would have accumulated, and even to move things around becomes more complex and at times more expensive as well. So there is that financial education which is needed at a younger stage before athletes start to make or start to generate a lot of their wealth. I think in terms of image right companies as well, a lot of the things he mentioned, I completely agree with, and also we see them from a Malta side of things. I also saw recently HMRC issued guidelines on this, and the Maltese tax authorities would take a similar stance. So I think what's important when we look at the image right companies or management companies, or when we look at really international tax planning in general, I think the whole element of substance has become crucial. So we don't simply look at these companies just to channel some income for tax reduction purposes. I call them proper management companies, which, as Mo mentioned, actually deal with the athletes, deal with the image rights, take the decisions, exploit the assets, review contracts, as it should be. And this is what we typically do set up when we look at these type of companies here in Malta. We take a role as advisors, either to the board or sit on the board together with the athlete's agent, the foreign advisor, and properly manage the affairs, whether the direct affairs relating to the golfers' tournaments, their winnings, or even exploitation of assets in terms of brands and other similar assets which they may have. Valuation is also important, as Mo also mentioned. So from our end, we have also an economic team which handles the valuation of athletes, because that is also key in understanding the asset, one which can be transferred and held in the company, and what type of exploitation are we looking at, because it's not something which we simply throw a figure at and say, this is what we think the value of the athlete is. There needs to be a proper economic analysis around those assets. But I think the key thing around these companies is having the proper substance around them, and actually having the proper advisors on board that they exploit an asset which today is no longer held by an athlete, but is held by a separate person, which is now what we so-called the image rights company.
And I mean, in this case, we've got a UK domiciled individual, which makes it challenging for trust planning. But if the client here was non-domicile, I guess it would open out interlinkage with trusts as well, obviously taking the correct tax advice. But I imagine that is also a reasonably common setup with image right structures, to look at the use of trusts to hold those assets to, and look at the succession planning position.
Look, with a golfer, so typically what we would do with such athletes who are, I call them, as I mentioned earlier, mobile athletes. So people who are traveling around the globe with tournaments all over the place and are not fixed in one jurisdiction for 8, 9, 10 months of the year. We look at it from a trust point of view, but also from a tax perspective. So as you know, Malta's tax system is similar to the UK. It's a remittance base of taxation, and the professional golfers, I would say all of their tournaments are outside of Malta. So whilst there would be a withholding tax on the winnings when they win tournaments in certain jurisdictions, there's no further tax than if they are tax resident in Malta, and if they make Malta their base, unless that money is remitted into Malta. Again, same thing here. So the tax residence has to be a proper tax residence and not simply one on paper. So we have a number of golfers who come here, train in Malta on our golf course, but obviously then travel regularly for their tournaments. The trust side of things is also important, and that is where we would work with somebody like Chris on this, and also with regard to something which Mo touched upon earlier. I think some problem we find with certain athletes is that they make a lot of money at a younger age, and they think that this is going to keep on going forever. And they don't realize that, unfortunately, either through injury or because a career has to stop, then all of a sudden, even if they have endorsements, sponsorships, and other investments or businesses, their revenue typically drops after the age of 30 or mid-30s. So that is where we come in as trustees to manage their wealth, but that is where then we need advisors such as Chris to invest it. Because when we look at the wealth management side of things, we manage it as trustees, but then we need the investment advice to ensure that the money which is generated, typically, maybe not for golfers, but for other sports persons, typically in the early 20s, is something which is maintained well post their career, and sometimes even post after their death, for the heirs to enjoy as well. We see a lot of, you see a lot in the news of a number of high profile athletes which go bankrupt right after the career ends. Again, not having proper financial advisors on board, having proper financial planners on board, amongst other things, obviously, because that is not the only reason why that happens. Mo mentioned certain relationship issues. There are also relationships with friends, which could also result in the athlete ending up in a difficult financial situation. So there are a lot of different things to cover. And what was also mentioned as well is that ultimately we become the trusted advisors of these individuals. So typically anything they need and the different requests we get from these clients are also because we become the trusted advisors, and they know that we will want to manage their assets whilst at the same time planning for a tax efficient perspective in the best interests and eventually in the children's as well.
Okay, thanks. And Mo mentioned about disputes that can arise. If we had a Malta image rights structure with the substance behind it, and disputes were arising that came to court in Malta, how do the Maltese courts, resolve such legal issues? What would the experience be of the team around the player as well as the player themselves?
So I think, look, it's important definitely to have the right legal advisors on board in this. I can't say there are many. Firstly, the number of image rights companies in Malta are obviously much smaller than the ones in the UK and also other jurisdictions. The number of image rights companies which end up in court in Malta are few and far between, also because of the limited number that exists. But either way, again, although the company could be Maltese, most transactions, sponsorship deals, athletes, winnings, and everything are touched upon in different jurisdictions. So that is where also we would work with a firm like Mo's, because we don't solely look at what works for Malta and that's it. But we need to make sure that from a tax, wealth planning, and also legal point of view, it works in every jurisdiction where the athlete could either have a dispute or possibly a tax charge. Our expertise are solely local from a Maltese perspective, but then we need advisors like Chris on board, because the athletes clearly are not based solely in Malta. And as I mentioned earlier, in most cases, 100% of their winnings arise outside of Malta.
Okay, perfect. And if Jack did want to explore more closely becoming Maltese resident, the situation around becoming a resident Malta has changed in recent times. It'd be interesting to hear, particularly if he was involved in setting up structures with commercial substance on the island, how that would look, what the benefit would be in this post-Brexit world.
Yes, look, there's a lot of work also we do in the immigration space, so with residents, and also in certain cases, maybe not so with the sports, but more in the entertainment industry, for example, with citizenship in Malta. So obtaining residence or even citizenship in Malta is not a complicated process. Obviously, Brexit made it slightly more complicated because Jack is now deemed from a Maltese point of view, and not only as a non-EU national. But yes, there are different tax or residence programs as to how Jack can become resident here. And it very much depends on what type of income Jack is going to have, whether that is going to be remitted to Malta or not, because certain tax programs also offer certain tax benefits. But again, we do have programs which could involve Jack, his wife, children, and the whole process of obtaining residence in Malta within 3 to 4 months, which offer the benefits, as I mentioned earlier, the remittance base of taxation, which also, although there isn't any specific number of days according to Maltese law which Jack is expected to spend in Malta, but it cannot simply be a tax residence on paper. Similar to the image rights companies we mentioned earlier, substance, whether for the company or for the individual, is extremely important. And to be honest, whilst a number of athletes might have either not visited Malta before, or some of them not even heard about Malta, when they come here with their family, they enjoy it. So the few months they spend here when they are not training overseas, they actually enjoy it and therefore create a presence for themselves when they are not traveling on sports engagements.
Okay, perfect. Well, just to bring this conversation to a close, I'm just going to come to each of you to ask if you had a meeting with Jack, you took a call from Jack, you looked at his situation based on these basic facts we've laid out. What would you suggest to him are some of the top priorities, some of the things you look at first? Perhaps Chris, on the wealth management side, the financial planning side, I'd come to you first. Where would you kick off a conversation with Jack?
Yeah, I think given all the things we mentioned before in terms of wanting to understand what his objectives are, I think that there's a clear need for the tax position is very important. And we mentioned residency and domicile, and I think that tax conversation would probably be the initial starting point for me to make sure that the structures that you're looking to invest within or plan for are appropriate, one, in the UK at the moment, but two, for the future, depending on what he wants to do in Malta, and then when the family actually pass over there as well. I would probably say, which is why I think we've all said it's extremely important to have a team like everybody around us. There's no point just having a wealth planner, because you need a lawyer, you need an accountant, you need people who have boots on the ground in local jurisdiction to understand that properly. I think some of the other smaller, sort of softer facts as well for individuals looking to move abroad from the UK in terms of getting your house in order before you go is just the small things like making sure your mortgage is appropriate. So if you're going to keep a property in the UK or you're going to sell that and move abroad, often once you've left the UK, it might be difficult for you to sort your mortgage out for a UK-based property. Things like what you're going to do about bank accounts, the logistics of FX and currency exchange, particularly important for golfers given their sort of international base. And other things like life insurance and career ending, which I mentioned earlier on. You might not be able to put that life insurance or career ending insurance in place when you're no longer a UK resident or in the UK, or you might be restricting those providers that you use depending on where you move to. So it's not just the planning and the investment, it's actually what's the softer facts that look around the edges for the overall wealth planning if you're looking to move abroad.
Very interesting. Many thanks for that. Mo, from your side, if you had a sit down with Jack, what would you be? How would you be opening up the conversation?
It would be very similar to what Chris has mentioned. I think a lot of what drives the legal work is the tax advice and the planning, because we can't. That's kind of the horse bolting before the cart kind of thing. So we can't really do much without that. So I'd be strongly saying to him, go and speak to this is your team. Go and have a coffee with them, go meet them ASAP with not only with what you're doing here in the UK, but whatever your plans are to move out. And also we will all have connections abroad, and we've all got connections. Nikki has obviously in Malta, to understand, is that the right jurisdiction? Is that the right place you want to go to? So there's a properly considered conversation as to the plans for the professional playing side for Jack. The other thing I'd mentioned to him, obviously, as you'd expect, is for me to look at his agreements and see how things are currently structured. So if I was sitting with Jack right now, I'd say, look, we would need to really understand the landscape of where things are at, and that would feed into Nikki and to Chris and say, okay, we've identified some red flags here. These are the red flags. We will need to get these sorted before we can even progress with what we want to do. So that's quite big. And probably the last point I'd probably be talking to Jack about is, as a high-profile athlete, the other considerations from a family point of view, his brand point of view, what does he want to achieve? Like, where does he see himself being positioned? Many athletes now are quite linear in their approach with the brand. They see themselves as, I can model myself on an existing high-profile athlete and just go that direction. Or alternatively, is he looking to do something slightly different, where he wants to pivot and then utilize his image or his brand for potentially a merchandising company or something else? But that will be elicited from Chris's conversation on the objective side of things. So as you're probably hearing, it all links very carefully and neatly with what Chris and Nikki will be talking about with Jack, and supporting that.
Okay, perfect. Nikki, any closing comments, thoughts that you'd be
I think linking to also what Chris and Mo said, I think it's also understanding what Jack's plans would be for the next few years, because possibly his winnings or his income directly from golf might start to decline, and he might start earning income from other sources. And then we would see how to best structure that to see if Malta is a solution, because Malta is not always a solution, but in certain instances it works. And also to couple that with his personal needs. Because he might want to relocate with his family to Malta, he might not. So then the structure might need to change as well, depending on where he is going to be as an individual. So we would need to look at both the structure and also the personal and family needs. And then again, everything remains very international, even past their career. So advising together with, for example, Mo and Chris on this would give Jack a holistic look at things, not just from a Malta point of view.
Okay, well, many thanks. Thanks for joining us today for the Malta Insight Series. We hope you join us next time and keep following this content that we're producing in partnership with Seed. So thank you for joining us today, and good day.